Welcome back, dear listener. Tonight we are going somewhere cold, somewhere that smells of salt and tar and the particular darkness that only exists far out at sea, where there is no land in any direction and the horizon is just a line between two kinds of nothing. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Pull your blanket a little closer. And if you enjoy what we do here, a like and a subscription means the world to this quiet corner of history. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what the weather is like where you are. Now dim the lights. Let the world outside fall away. And step carefully onto the deck. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Even before your eyes adjust to the dark, the smell finds you. Salt, of course, always salt, so thick in the air you can taste it. But beneath that, something older and heavier. Tar, worked into every plank and rope. Wet wool. The faint sweetness of rotting wood somewhere deep in the hull. And underneath all of it, the smell of the men themselves, 20 or 30 of them living in a space no larger than a modest house, without fresh water for washing, without any real way to escape each other. You pull your collar up against the wind and remind yourself that these men chose this life, or were driven to it, which amounts to the same thing in the end. The ship moves beneath your feet in a way that takes some getting used to. It is not the gentle rocking that comes to mind when people imagine the sea. It is something more irregular than that, more insistent. The hull lifts and drops in response to swells that have been traveling across the ocean for hundreds of miles, carrying the energy of distant storms that no one on this ship will ever see. Every few minutes there is a heavier roll, and you instinctively shift your weight the way the sailors have learned to do without thinking. They call it your sea legs, the ability to move with the ship rather than against it, and it takes weeks to develop. The deck is slippery. That is the other thing no one tells you. Every surface on this ship is slippery. The planks are soaked through with seawater and spray, and where it has not simply remained wet, it has dried into a crust of salt that becomes treacherous the moment any moisture returns, which is always. The ropes you reach for to steady yourself are stiff with salt crystals that cut into your palms. The iron fittings on the rails are colder than anything you have ever touched on land. You pull your hand back quickly and feel the burning sting that comes with cold metal on warm skin. Somewhere above you in the rigging, a rope snaps against the mast in the wind. The sound is sharp and lonely in the darkness. The sails above your head are enormous shapes of pale canvas, barely visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, straining and bulging as the wind presses into them. You cannot see the men who are up there tending to the rigging, but you know they are there, because this ship does not sail itself, and someone is always up in that darkness, working with numb fingers on stiff ropes in the cold. This is where we begin our night. Not in a comfortable cabin or in front of a warm fire. Out here on the deck of a ship that is probably somewhere in the North Atlantic, or perhaps threading its way through the cold gray waters of the English Channel, or following the coastline of Scandinavia northward toward waters where the summer sun barely sets and the winter brings darkness that lasts for months. The pirates who sailed these routes in the medieval period, roughly from the 13th century through to the 16th, knew a cold that most people today have never experienced and would not choose to. And the question of how they slept, how they found rest at all in conditions like these, is one that historians have been piecing together from scattered sources for decades. The short answer is that they barely did. The longer answer is what we are here for tonight. You move carefully toward the stern, where a small hatch leads down into the ship's interior. The ladder is steep and the rungs are rough under your fingers. You feel the change in atmosphere before you have finished descending. The wind cuts off. The sound of the sea changes from something external to something felt through the wood surrounding you. And the smell intensifies. Down here it is warmer, but the warmth is complicated. It is the warmth of too many bodies in too small a space. The warmth of breath and sweat, and the last of the cooking fire in the galley, all trapped together in a space sealed against the cold outside. The lower deck is not what you might imagine if your ideas about pirate ships come from paintings or novels or films. It is not a grand space with hammocks swaying in neat rows. It is cramped and low-ceilinged and cluttered. Every spare inch is occupied. Barrels of provisions are lashed in place along the walls, which curve inward following the shape of the hull. Coils of rope take up space on the floor. There are ropes hanging from hooks, clothing hanging from ropes, and tools tucked into any gap they will fit. The light from a lantern hung near the center swings with the motion of the ship, throwing shadows that seem to move independently of the objects that cast them. The hammocks are there, but there are not enough for everyone, and the ones that exist are not the airy canvas slings of a well-equipped naval vessel. They are rough things made of whatever cloth could be acquired or improvised, some of sailcloth, some of ordinary fabric, some patched together from several different materials that have never quite decided to become a single piece. The men who cannot get a hammock sleep on the floor between the barrels, or wedged against the hull, or sitting up with their backs against whatever solid surface will keep them from rolling. Sleeping on a ship that is always moving requires an accommodation with that movement that takes time and practice to develop. The body eventually learns to follow the roll rather than resist it. But new arrivals spend their first nights sliding and bracing and jolting awake. And even the most experienced sailors never sleep as soundly at sea as they do on land. Historians who have studied the daily life of sailors and pirates during the medieval period have largely had to work from fragmentary sources. There were no ethnographers taking careful notes on the sleeping habits of pirates. There were court records from piracy trials, occasional accounts from prisoners or hostages who survived long enough to write about their experience, records from merchants whose ships were raided, and the logs of naval vessels that sometimes pursued or clashed with pirates. From these scattered documents, a picture emerges that is more complicated than the romantic image of the bold sea rover, and considerably less comfortable. A man named John Crabbe, a Flemish pirate who operated in the North Sea in the early 14th century, and whose activities were documented in some detail because he eventually became useful to the English crown, is known to have led crews of 20 to 40 men in vessels that were essentially converted merchant ships. His men would have slept in conditions not very different from what you see around you now. No dedicated sleeping quarters. No separation between the spaces used for sleeping and the spaces used for everything else. The same area where a man slept was the area where he ate, stored his belongings, kept his weapons, and spent whatever time he was not on deck working the ship. You watch one of the sleeping men shift in his hammock, his face flickering in the lantern light. He is wearing almost everything he owns. A rough woolen tunic, a heavier coat over that, and what appears to be a third layer of some kind of cloth wrapped around his shoulders. On his feet, his boots, which he has not removed. Records from the period consistently note that sailors and soldiers who slept in cold conditions learned not to take their boots off. The act of removing boots at the end of the day, so ordinary on land, was a luxury that cold temperatures made genuinely dangerous. Boots that were placed to one side could stiffen and freeze overnight, and a man who could not get his boots back on was a man who could not do his work, which was a man who was in trouble. The smell of the lower deck tells you what you need to know about the conditions down here. There is no real ventilation. The hatch you came through is the main entrance and exit for air as well as people. And when it is closed against the weather, the air quickly becomes heavy with carbon dioxide and the products of 30 human beings existing at close quarters. The lantern consumes some of the oxygen. The men sleeping exhale steadily into the confined space. By morning, the air quality will be noticeably worse than it is now, and no one will particularly notice, because this is what air has always smelled like in their experience of sleeping below deck. A curious detail that comes from the records of a merchant ship captured by pirates in the Baltic in 1389 is that the pirates who boarded the vessel immediately headed below decks, not in search of the cargo hold, but looking for blankets. The merchant crew had blankets, proper wool blankets, which were a commodity that the pirate crew apparently lacked. The record notes that there was a brief struggle over the blankets before the pirate captain imposed order, and that the blankets were divided among the crew according to some hierarchy that the merchant recorder could not quite understand, but which clearly mattered to everyone involved. This single detail tells you a great deal about how cold the ships were and how precious any means of warmth had become. You crouch beside one of the hammocks and look at the figure sleeping in it. His face is weathered in a way that makes it difficult to guess his age. He could be 30, or he could be 50. The sea does that to faces, works them over with salt air and wind and squinting against the light off the water until they develop a kind of timeless quality that is not quite age but is not quite youth either. His hands, which hang over the edge of the hammock, are remarkable. The skin is cracked in several places, the knuckles are enlarged, and there's a scar that runs across the back of the right hand from somewhere near the wrist to the first knuckle of the middle finger. His fingernails are split. The cold gets into split fingernails and makes them hurt in a way that is disproportionate to the injury. A persistent nagging pain that makes every grip difficult. He shifts slightly, murmuring something that is not quite a word, and the hammock swings slowly in response. The rope creaking softly against the hook from which it hangs. You find yourself wondering what he is dreaming about. Whether it is something warm, whether it is something he has left behind somewhere, whether it is anything at all, or whether after long enough at sea the mind stops bothering with dreams and settles for something simpler. A darkness uninterrupted until the watch bell calls it back. Outside, the wind picks up briefly, and you hear the ship respond. The sounds change. The creaking intensifies. The hammocks sway more firmly. One man opens his eyes for a moment, checks the angle of the lantern's swing to gauge how rough the sea has become, and closes them again. This is a skill, too. Reading the ship's behavior through sound and motion, knowing without looking whether the change in conditions requires you to get up or whether you can safely sleep through it. It takes years at sea to develop, and the men who have it are the ones who actually get any rest. The cold is the central fact of existence on a ship like this during the winter months, and managing it requires constant effort and ingenuity. There is no central heating, of course. There is no insulation in the walls. The planks of the hull are thick enough to keep the sea out, but they do nothing to keep the cold in check, and the cold at sea is different from the cold on land. It is wetter, which makes it more penetrating. It is more constant because there is no building to shelter in, no fire that is not a potentially catastrophic hazard on a wooden vessel at sea. The wind does not stop. The spray does not stop. And the temperature of the water itself, just a few inches below the planks you are standing on, stays cold enough to kill a person within minutes of immersion. Medieval ships had no way of heating their living quarters that did not involve an open flame. And open flames on wooden ships at sea were treated with the extreme caution they deserved. The galley, where cooking took place, had a small contained hearth of stone and iron, carefully designed to minimize the risk of fire and positioned centrally in the ship where it could be watched. This was the only source of heat on the entire vessel, and it was not always in use. Cooking happened at limited times of day, and between those times the hearth went cold. The warmth generated by cooking dissipated quickly in a space that was never truly sealed against the outside air. The primary method of keeping warm was the same one that humans have used since long before they had ships: body heat. The men below deck sleeping in proximity to each other were, in a very practical sense, keeping each other alive. The combined warmth of 30 bodies in an enclosed space raises the ambient temperature measurably, and sleeping close together raises it further. Records from various maritime sources of the period describe men sharing blankets, sleeping back to back, and generally arranging themselves in ways that maximize the sharing of body warmth. There was nothing sentimental about this. It was survival. You notice now that the hammocks on one side of the lower deck are strung close enough together that the men in them are almost touching when the ship rolls in a certain direction. This is not an accident. The arrangement has been arrived at through accumulated experience. The understanding that warmth shared is warmth preserved, and that a few inches of space between sleeping bodies is a few inches of cold air that serves no purpose. Some of the men below the hammocks, sleeping on the planking, have arranged themselves in a cluster, backs and sides in contact, a tangle of limbs that would look uncomfortable to an observer from land, but which represents a reasonably effective solution to the problem of keeping 4 bodies warm with the heat generated by 4 bodies. A fascinating detail from a court record of 1423, involving the testimony of a man who had spent several months as a prisoner on a pirate vessel operating out of a Breton port, describes the sleeping arrangements in terms that suggest they were organized according to a rough social hierarchy. The captain and any officers slept closest to what small warmth the galley provided, in slightly more sheltered positions. The common crew slept further from this warmth. Newcomers and captives were assigned the coldest, most exposed positions by default, and worked their way toward the warmer areas of the sleeping space over time as the crew came to trust and accept them. The warmest spots, the informant noted, were more jealously guarded than any share of the loot. You make your way back up through the hatch onto the deck, because there is something you need to understand about the structure of sleep on a ship like this that can only be understood from above. The night watch. On land, sleep is generally a single continuous event. You go to sleep in the evening and you wake in the morning, and unless something disturbs you, the night is simply an absence. On a ship at sea, this is not possible. A ship at sea cannot be left unattended for the hours of darkness. Someone must always be at the wheel. Someone must always be watching for other ships, for rocks, for changes in the weather. Someone must be monitoring the sails, adjusting the lines, maintaining the course. A ship without people working it at night is a ship that is drifting toward whatever the night happens to contain, which might be nothing or might be disaster. The watch system divides the night into sections, and each section is manned by a portion of the crew while the rest attempt to sleep. The standard division in the medieval period, insofar as there was a standard, was roughly 4-hour watches. This meant that even the most fortunate member of the crew could count on no more than 4 uninterrupted hours of sleep before being called back to work. And 4 hours was only possible when conditions allowed it, which was not always. In bad weather, all hands might be required on deck, and the concept of sleeping hours became theoretical. The man at the wheel now is gripping it with both hands, and you can see from the tension in his arms that the sea is not entirely cooperative. He does not look at you. He is watching the compass and the horizon and the behavior of the sails, processing all of this information simultaneously, The way a driver in bad conditions processes multiple streams of information without being entirely conscious of doing so. His coat is stiff. There is frost along the edges of his collar. His breath comes in steady, visible puffs. You stand near him for a while, watching the deck. It is not quiet, exactly, but the sounds have a different quality in the deep part of the night. The creaking of the ship, the movement of the water, the wind through the rigging, which produces a constant low musical note that changes pitch with the speed of the wind. These sounds have been present throughout the day, but during the day they are background to the human noise of the crew working and talking and existing. At this hour, they move into the foreground and become the primary experience of the ship. The historian and writer Samuel Eliot Morison, who sailed traditional routes in traditional vessels to understand maritime history from the inside, described the sound of a wooden ship at sea at night as like being inside a living thing, something that breathes and shifts and speaks in a language that is not quite intelligible but carries meaning nonetheless. The man on watch has learned to hear this language. He knows which sounds are normal and which represent a problem that needs addressing. A particular pitch from a certain section of rigging means that line is too taut and needs adjustment. A change in the rhythm of the hull's movement through the water can indicate a shift in the sea state that might require changes to the sails. He hears all of this while staying warm enough to function, which requires its own management. He stamps his feet periodically on the deck, a habit so ingrained it has become unconscious. He flexes his hands around the wheel. He shifts his weight from foot to foot. Keeping the blood moving is not a comfort measure. It is a medical necessity. Frostbite begins when circulation to the extremities is compromised, and it begins faster than most people expect. The question of what the pirates wore at night, when attempting to sleep, is one that historians have been able to piece together from a combination of sources. There was no such thing as nightclothes in the modern sense for men of this class and period. You wore what you had. When you slept, you wore what you had been wearing all day. When the cold was severe, you added whatever additional layers you could accumulate. The ideal, according to the medical understanding of the time, which was based on classical theory that had been filtered through medieval interpretation and bore only an approximate relationship to what we now understand about cold and the human body, was to layer wool close to the skin. Wool retained some of its insulating properties even when wet, which distinguished it from other available fabrics. And the men who sailed these waters had learned this empirically, if not theoretically. A detail that appears in several different sources from different parts of Northern Europe is the practice of applying animal fats to exposed skin before sleeping in cold conditions. Whale oil was used where it was available. Seal fat was another option. The fat was rubbed into the face and hands, the areas of skin that could not be covered by clothing, and formed a layer that reduced heat loss from the skin's surface and provided some protection against wind chill. The smell this produced was, by all accounts, considerable. The men who slept in proximity to someone who had applied whale oil to their skin were in no position to object, because the smell of 20 people who had not washed properly in weeks was itself a considerable experience. And whale oil was simply one more note in a composition that had long since abandoned conventional standards of acceptability. A curious medical text from the 15th century, compiled by a physician who had spent time at sea with Portuguese naval expeditions, includes a section on the management of cold during maritime voyages that describes a practice of soaking wool cloths in warmed oil and wrapping them around the feet before sleeping. The cloths would cool overnight, obviously, but the oil retained some warmth longer than dry cloth, and the wrapping provided an additional layer of insulation. The same text recommends sharing a blanket between two men rather than each having their own, on the grounds that the heat generated by two bodies under a single blanket is greater than the heat retained by each body under a separate blanket. This seems obvious from our vantage point, but it represents real practical knowledge being systematically recorded and passed on. You think about this as you look back at the hatch leading below. The men down there, the ones sleeping, are not simply sleeping. They are managing their survival. Every decision about where to sleep and how to position themselves and what to wear and how close to lie to their neighbors is a decision with thermal consequences. The accumulated wisdom that guides these decisions was developed over generations of sailors, learning what worked and what did not, often at the cost of lost fingers, lost toes, and occasionally lost lives. The sounds of the ship at night are worth sitting with for a moment longer, because they are central to the experience of sleeping here, or trying to. The creaking of the planks is the most constant sound, and it varies in quality depending on where you are in the ship. Near the stern, it is a deep, grinding sound as the rudder assembly works against the force of the water. Amidships, it is more of a flexing, rhythmic sound, the planks working against each other in the way that wooden structures in motion always work, the joints moving fractionally with every roll and swell. Near the bow, you can hear the water itself hitting the hull, a deep, rhythmic concussion that is felt as much as heard. The rigging produces its own constant contribution. Ropes under tension vibrate when the wind moves across them, and depending on the thickness of the rope and the tension it is under, this vibration produces notes of different pitch. On a full-rigged ship with many ropes and many different states of tension, the result is something resembling a chord, a complex cluster of pitches that shifts as the wind changes speed and direction. Sailors in the medieval period described this sound in their limited written records in various ways. Some found it disturbing, especially when they were new to the sea. Others described it as becoming a source of comfort over time, something familiar that could be heard even in sleep, reassuring in its continuity, a sign that the ship and its rigging were intact and functioning. The men sleeping below decks were sleeping inside this sound. It surrounded them completely, entering through the planks and through the air and through the wood of whatever they were lying on. And it never stopped. For a person accustomed to the relative quiet of a medieval village or town, where the sounds of the night included occasional animal calls and wind through trees, but rarely the constant mechanical chorus of a working ship, this unceasing noise would have been deeply disturbing initially. The accounts of passengers on medieval vessels frequently mention the noise as one of the most difficult aspects of the experience. But among the regular crew, the opposite was eventually true. The sound became so associated with safety that its absence, experienced on land after a long voyage, could itself be disturbing. Historical sources record more than one instance of sailors who returned to land after months at sea and found themselves unable to sleep in the quiet. They had been conditioned to associate the sounds of the ship with the state of unconsciousness, and without those sounds, the unconscious state would not come. Some of them slept outdoors near the sea or near rivers where the sound of moving water provided something analogous to what their bodies had learned to need. Others simply spent weeks in insomnia before their nervous systems gradually recalibrated. The sea, once it has taken hold of a person, does not easily let them go. It is the middle of the night now, in the way that the middle of the night at sea can only be understood as an absence of any other time. The darkness is complete except for the faint phosphorescent glow of the water in the wake of the ship, a pale blue-green light that seems to come from nowhere and is produced by millions of microscopic organisms disturbed by the passage of the hull. In the medieval period, this phenomenon was sometimes interpreted as a supernatural sign. Sailors who had seen it attributed it to various causes: the breath of sea creatures, the trailing light of spirits following the ship, the reflection of stars from below the water's surface. None of these interpretations were correct, but they all acknowledged the reality of the phenomenon and integrated it into a coherent picture of the world, which is what human minds do with unexplained observations. Below decks, two men have woken and are sitting together near the galley, speaking quietly in a language you do not understand. Their voices are low, not from consideration for the sleeping men around them, exactly, but from the natural tendency to speak quietly in darkness. One of them has a small object in his hands that he is turning over and over, a carved piece of wood no larger than his fist. In the dim light, you cannot make out what it represents. He holds it like something valuable, which to him it clearly is. Objects like this, small personal possessions carried from home, were an important part of the psychological survival kit of men living indefinitely at sea. The historian Constance Jones has written about what she calls the portable familiar, the small object that anchors identity and memory to a specific place and time outside the perpetual present tense of the ship. These objects were kept tucked inside clothing, hidden from theft, maintained carefully in conditions that were hard on everything. The pirate who carved a smooth groove in a piece of driftwood and slept with his fingers around it night after night was doing something that looked trivial and was not. The two men stop speaking as you watch, without any particular reason, the conversation simply running out the way conversations do at 3 in the morning. They sit in companionable silence for a while. One of them eventually lies back down in his hammock with the smooth efficiency of a man who has performed this action thousands of times. The other remains sitting, staring at nothing in particular, his expression neither troubled nor peaceful, simply present in the way that sleepless people sometimes achieve, a kind of blank availability to whatever the darkness chooses to offer. Medical historians have noted that the sleep patterns of sailors in the medieval period were substantially different from those of people living on land, and different in ways that may have had lasting effects on their health. The constant interruption of sleep by watch duties, the irregular hours, the temperature variations, and the psychological stress of existing in a perpetually dangerous environment all disrupted the normal rhythms of sleep in ways that we now know to have serious consequences. Chronic sleep deprivation affects judgment, reaction time, emotional regulation, and immune function, among other things. The pirates and sailors of the medieval period did not have this vocabulary for what was happening to them, but they experienced its effects. The legendary irritability and unpredictability of sailors on long voyages was not simply a personality trait. It was, in part, the behavioral expression of people who were severely and chronically underslept. You find yourself a spot out of the wind near the base of the mainmast and sit down. The deck is cold through your clothing, and you shift and adjust until the discomfort reaches some kind of equilibrium with the desire to stay still. The watch officer passes without looking at you, his circuit of the deck a rhythm so ingrained it barely requires conscious direction. The stars above, where they show through gaps in the cloud, are the same stars these men have navigated by for the entirety of their careers. The North Star, steady above the northern horizon, giving the direction that the compass confirms. The familiar patterns of winter constellations, Orion standing in the south with his belt of 3 stars aligned, Cassiopeia tracing her zigzag line across the northern sky. The men who sailed by these stars had a relationship with them that is difficult to replicate in a world of electric light and GPS. For them, the night sky was not a backdrop but a working tool, read constantly, its messages as practical as a road sign. The ability to navigate by stars was knowledge that lived in the body as much as in the mind, the automatic raising of eyes to a certain point in the sky when a course needed checking, the assessment of a star's position relative to the horizon that provided both direction and rough latitude. This knowledge was passed from older sailors to younger ones, practically and orally, and it was knowledge that could not be taken away. A pirate who had lost everything, his ship, his crew, his accumulated goods, still retained his ability to look at the sky and know where he was. The wind is shifting slightly, and you notice the helmsman making adjustments that compensate for it, his hands moving on the wheel with a certainty that suggests he felt the change before he thought about it. The sails respond, and the ship's motion changes very slightly, settling into a new equilibrium with the altered conditions. The watch continues. The night continues. Below deck, the man who was sitting up has finally fallen asleep, or arrived at something close enough to sleep that the difference is academic. He is propped against a barrel with his chin on his chest, and his breathing has slowed into the deeper rhythm of unconsciousness. His hands rest open in his lap, relaxed for perhaps the first time in the waking hours. The piece of carved wood is still in one hand. The sleep of people in the medieval period, scholars of the history of sleep have established, was structured differently from our own, in ways that went beyond the situational disruptions of the sea. The idea of sleeping in a single continuous block from dark to dawn was not the universal norm that it later became. Many sources from the medieval period describe a first sleep that lasted several hours, followed by a period of waking of an hour or two, followed by a second sleep that lasted until morning. The waking period was not considered a problem to be solved. It was treated as a natural part of the night, a time for quiet activity, for prayer, for conversation, for the kind of reflective thinking that daylight hours did not accommodate. On a ship, this natural rhythm intersected with the watch system in interesting ways. A man whose body wanted to wake in the middle of his sleeping period might find that his watch duty conveniently fell in that interval, allowing him to perform his required work during the hours when wakefulness came naturally. Or he might find the reverse, that the demands of the watch fractured his sleep at points that left him worse rested than he would have been otherwise. The relationship between the individual body's sleep requirements and the collective demands of keeping a ship running was negotiated differently by every crew, and the records we have suggest that this negotiation was a constant source of friction and adaptation. The historian A. Roger E. Kirch, whose research into the history of sleep patterns has been widely cited, notes that the literary and documentary record of the medieval period is full of references to the middle of the night as an active time, a time when things happened that could not happen at other hours. Prayers were said, confessions were made, illicit meetings occurred, and on ships, the middle of the night was when certain kinds of conversations took place that the daylight hours did not permit. The darkness equalizer. In the dark, the captain was no more visible than any other man. In the dark, voices carried different weight than they did in the hierarchical daylight. The cold is intensifying now, in the way that cold at sea intensifies in the hours just before dawn, when the heat accumulated during the day has long since dissipated and the sun is still hours away from beginning to rebuild it. You can see your breath clearly now, each exhalation a small cloud of vapor that the wind immediately disperses. The spray from the bow reaches as far back as the mast, and where it has settled on surfaces and begun to dry, it has left white patterns of crystallized salt, intricate and meaningless as snowflakes. The man at the wheel has been relieved by another man, and the exchange was accomplished in silence and in the dark, with the practiced efficiency of something done many times. The original helmsman has gone below. He will sleep now, or try to, in the narrow hours before his next watch. The new helmsman checks the compass and adjusts the course fractionally, then settles into the stance of vigilance, the slightly forward lean, the grip on the wheel that is firm but not tense. 4 hours. That is what he has until he is replaced. 4 hours of standing in the cold, watching the sea and the compass and the sky, responsible for the safety of everyone below him and the course of the ship through the dark. If he falls asleep, the ship will drift. If he drifts in temperature, his judgment will fail before he loses consciousness, and he may make decisions that seem correct to him in his cold-impaired state, and are not. The cold was understood in the medieval period to affect the mind, though the mechanism was not understood. Sailors knew that men who became too cold made poor decisions, became confused, sometimes became oddly cheerful in a way that was recognized as dangerous. We would now describe this as the behavioral effects of hypothermia on the prefrontal cortex, the loss of executive function that makes the cold an insidious threat, because it removes the very capacity for judgment that would allow a person to recognize they are in danger. The man at the wheel has learned to manage this. He stamps his feet. He keeps moving. He forces himself to make the circuit of the deck at regular intervals even when the compass demands nothing of him, because the movement keeps the blood going. He is not thinking about the physiology. He is following practice that he was taught by someone older and more experienced than him, who was taught it by someone older and more experienced still, and whose foundations are the accumulated wisdom of generations of men who learned by surviving and by watching others fail to survive. The first gray light, when it comes from below the horizon first. A brightening of the sky's lowest edge that is not yet light so much as the anticipation of light. The stars begin to fade, not because they have gone anywhere, but because the sky is becoming less dark. And against a less dark sky, the fainter ones disappear first. The ship's ropes and rigging emerge from the general darkness as individual shapes. The deck planks take on their grain and texture again, and the sea reveals itself as a surface rather than an infinite black void. The crew begins to stir. Not all at once. Not with the sudden alertness that comes in emergencies. With the gradual surfacing of people who have been sleeping in layers, consciousness returning from the outermost layer inward, awareness of the body returning, then awareness of the ship, then awareness of the day and its requirements. Men roll from their hammocks or push themselves up from the deck with the particular stiffness of bodies that have been cold all night. They flex their hands, which are never quite fully warm until the middle of the day. They stretch in ways that look inadequate to the stiffness they are fighting. The cook, if this ship has a cook rather than simply a rotation of men assigned to cooking duty, is among the first to be seriously active. The galley fire must be started, and while a small fire is being coaxed from carefully preserved embers, the water for whatever is being eaten or drunk this morning must be measured out from the carefully maintained fresh water stores. Fresh water at sea is never to be wasted. Every drop that goes overboard or is carelessly spilled is a drop that cannot be replaced until the next rain or the next port, and both rain and ports could be far away. The management of fresh water was one of the constant disciplines of life at sea, as fundamental as managing the sails or the weapons. The smell that begins to come from the galley hatch is not the smell of anything that would be described as good on land. It is the smell of something hot, which in this context is exactly what it needs to be. Thin porridge, most likely, or ship's biscuits soaked in whatever liquid is available until the density of rock it has acquired during its weeks of storage softens to something that can be consumed without breaking teeth. This is breakfast. It is not a meal that anyone would choose, given alternatives. But it is hot, and it is being passed from hand to hand across the deck, and the men who receive it curve their hands around the containers it comes in and hold them simply for the warmth before consuming the contents. Historical records from various maritime contexts in the medieval and early modern period consistently record the disproportionate importance of hot food and drink in the well-being of crews at sea in cold conditions. A hot meal did not provide substantially more nutrition than the same food consumed cold, but its effects on morale, on the perception of comfort, on the willingness to face another day of difficult conditions were recognized by commanders and ship's officers as far exceeding its caloric content. An officer who contrived to provide his men with something hot to drink on a particularly cold morning was an officer who understood that the management of his crew's psychological state was as important as the management of his ship. You watch the men emerge one by one from below, squinting against the gray light that is now filling the sky without yet providing any warmth. Each man's first action on deck is to assess the conditions: the check of the horizon, the check of the rigging, the read of the sea state. These assessments are made automatically in the first seconds before full consciousness has been established. Then comes the huddling. Men who spent the night in the warmth of proximity to each other now seek that proximity again above deck, gathering near the galley hatch where the smell of the cook fire carries some of its warmth, or standing in clusters with their backs to the wind, their shoulders touching. The sounds of the ship in the morning are different from the sounds of the night. There are voices again, instructions and responses, and the kind of ambient commentary that people produce when they are collectively awake and working. Short observations about the conditions, brief exchanges about tasks, the occasional outbreak of something that is technically laughter, though it comes through cold, stiffened faces and sounds rougher than laughter on land. The ship is alive again in a different way than it was during the night watches. Alive with the particular energy of people who have survived another night and are getting on with what comes next. The question of how people sleep without adequate warmth, without comfortable beds, without silence or darkness or any of the conditions that modern sleep medicine identifies as conducive to rest, is one that the men on this ship have been answering every night for as long as they have been at sea. They sleep because the body demands it, past the point where comfort is a relevant consideration. They sleep in segments, between duties, between watches, whenever the demands of the ship relent long enough for unconsciousness to claim them. They sleep wearing everything they own and lying against each other for warmth. They sleep to the sound of a living ship and a living sea, sounds that have stopped being disturbing and have become, through long association, the sound of safety. Helmsman of the night watch is finally going below. He moves slowly, his joints stiff, his face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from hours of cold alertness. He will sleep for a few hours if he's lucky. The sea will rock him in his hammock, just as it has been rocking him upright at the wheel all night, and his body, which has been managing the cold and the vigilance and the darkness, will use those hours of relative warmth and stillness to conduct its maintenance, to repair what the night has taken from it, to restore enough of what was spent to face another night when it comes. You stay on deck as the morning opens around you. The cold is still there. It will be there until spring if they are still at sea in spring. But it has backed off slightly with the light, the way cold does when there is something to see, as if the visual world provides its own warmth simply by existing. The sea moves in long, slow swells that catch the early light on their faces and hold it briefly before releasing it. The ship moves through this landscape with the deliberateness of a thing that knows what it is doing, which in a sense it does, having been shaped over decades of use to do exactly this, to move through water and wind, to be sailed. The men are at work now. The business of the ship does not pause because the night was cold or because some of the crew are still sleeping below. There are ropes to be checked, damage from the night to be assessed and repaired, the course to be reviewed and maintained, the provisions to be managed. The hierarchies of the ship express themselves in the assignment of tasks, the captain or whoever leads this particular crew making the decisions that are his to make. The more experienced men taking the work that requires judgment, the newer or lower-ranking men taking the work that requires only effort. On a pirate vessel, the hierarchy was often less formal than on a naval ship, sometimes arrived at through a kind of rough democracy in which the crew had a genuine voice in decisions. But hierarchy existed nonetheless. It always does on a ship, because someone has to be responsible for whether the ship survives, and responsibility always implies authority. From somewhere below, through the hatch, you hear a sound that might be snoring. One of the men who was sleeping when you first arrived has slept through the morning transition and is still down there in his hammock, his body insisting on its rest regardless of what the ship and the day require of him. In a few minutes, someone will shake him awake, or the noise of the working ship overhead will penetrate his sleep and bring him up. But for now, he is still under, still in whatever the sleep of exhausted men in cold places contains, gone from the world of the ship and into something else entirely. And you, standing here on this deck with the morning light growing around you and the cold settling into its familiar companionship and the sound of the sea doing what it always does, you begin to understand something about what these men lived. Not the romance of it, not the danger, not the freedom or the violence that the word pirate brings to mind, but the simple human stubborn persistence of it. The daily negotiation with cold and discomfort and sleeplessness, the small victories of a hammock secured, a hot drink shared, a night survived without catastrophe. The way that the body, given no alternative, adapts to almost anything and finds its rest where it can find it. The ship moves on through the morning sea. The sleeping man below will wake soon. The men on deck will work through the day, and some of them will sleep through portions of it, and all of them will face another night of cold and watches, and the sounds of a wooden ship working through the water in the dark. And you, dear listener, are warm where you are. You have a blanket, probably, and a comfortable place to lie, and no watch duty that will call you awake in 2 hours. The silence around you is the silence of chosen stillness, rather than the absence that comes from exhaustion. Let the sound of the sea find you now, from a great distance and from the safety of land. Let the rocking of the ship become the gentlest thing imaginable, a rhythm that carries you rather than demands from you. The men of this ship found their rest where they could, in snatches and fragments, and the small warmth of each other's proximity. You can find yours now, complete and uninterrupted, in the quiet that follows the telling of their story. The ship drifts on through the dark water. The stars are coming out again. The cold is patient, as it always has been, waiting for its turn. And somewhere below the waterline, in the deepest and most constant part of the sea's voice, there's a sound like breathing, like the whole ocean breathing, steady and slow and very, very old. Good night. Sleep well. And I will see you next time for another quiet journey through the corridors of history. Sweet dreams.